Hello, everyone, and welcome to Quantumrun-on-One, a podcast where we interview leading experts, researchers, and thinkers to gain their insights into the emerging trends and innovations that will reshape our world over the next 2 decades. My name's David Tall, and I'm your host. In this episode, we're interviewing Nick Price, a professional futurist, strategy developer, advisor, and speaker. He helps clients take actions based on informed views about the future, and with a background in technology, design, and business, he's done his work around the world, all while living in Australia, the Netherlands, the US, and the UK. During our chat, Nick is going to share his insights into some of the latest news and trends he's been tracking. We also talk about what attracted him to the field of futurism and the business value of thinking beyond the standard 1 to 3 year strategic plans. So without further ado, here's your conversation with Nick Price. Nick, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, David. Lovely to talk to you.
Right. And, we've been looking forward to having you on the show. And it's always nice to speak with a fellow futurist professional. So, it's something we've been looking forward to. I guess one of the ways I always like to start these podcasts is by asking our guests to share the top 2 or 3 future trends they're thinking about most these days. We'll talk through each one for a bit, but, for you, what future trends are you most excited or intrigued by these days?
Okay, I've got 3 sort of clusters I'd like to share with you today, things that are attracting me. And the first one is, it's about money. It's about how money, forms of money are transforming. So in Europe, there's a lot of interest in cash disappearing, moving to a completely electronic form of money.
And what are the reasons for that, do you think? Is it social, political, economic?
Part fashion, I think, but it becomes fashionable it's just more, it seems more convenient to have electronic cash. There's also commercially, it can be easier to move electronic money around as opposed to physical cash. There's new microtransactions, so you're using electronic transactions for public transport, for example. So it's becoming more common to introduce a monetary microtransaction as opposed to a big chunky transaction. So there's interesting pressures on cash, and particularly around the way that inflation is behaving and growth is behaving. There's interest in, as economies want to have better fiscal management of their economies, then if everyone's money is held digitally, that can give them more tools to work with it. For example, the pressures of the aging population, where you might have to manage funds on behalf of people.
I see. So this is something that, in North America has been kind of lagging, I guess, in comparison to Europe and especially Asia with regards to this move to purely digital currencies. What are the technologies that are kind of enabling this?
Well, there's different types of technologies. Obviously, there's the evolution of the payment card in the pocket, then the mobile phone with near-field communication and the ability for your phone to be an electronic wallet, as well as a stronger telecommunications infrastructure. So using telecommunications to reaching many more physical places allows you to carry transactions over a network.
And do you think that if this kind of electronic currency is going to continue to be dominated by, the banks, or do you foresee companies like Google or Apple trying to create their own credit card system or payment system that basically disrupts traditional banks out of their business?
Yeah, that gets to the broader way that the payments are changing. And so, for example, in foreign exchange, there's been a lot of competition against traditional banks to facilitate the transfer of funds between countries. And so that's where we get new providers coming in with infrastructure, with less infrastructure investment, old infrastructure investment, and new infrastructure investment. So there can be new participants in that market, but I wouldn't say new value systems per se, inventing their new currencies. Although in the social side of things, in Europe, there are experiments with local currencies, for example. So we start to look how people can translate their their time. You'd be doing voluntary work, and you might receive time back from someone else for doing a different task. And to do that, you might use an intermediate currency, a local pound or a local instrument with a closed circulation. And that becomes interesting because money is a way of taking value across time. It's almost like a little time machine.
Right.
It's got value suspended there. And particularly as we see social pressures and we need more social care services, then independent monetary systems can help people, communities, exchange effort for tasks within them.
It's interesting because governments, use their monetary policy and control over money to control their population and control how business is done within the country and how money flows through it. With these kind of more independent or closed loop currency systems coming into place, is that something that you think wider national governments will adopt or condone? Because we're already seeing the kind of pushback against Bitcoin in some countries where this new independent transnational currency is not something that can be controlled by countries. So they're trying to push against or make the use of Bitcoin illegal in many cases.
And some countries have introduced clauses to their banking acts to include blockchain or Bitcoin or digital currency transactions within it. So they'll change their banking act such that if a transaction takes place over a digital currency, digital cash currency medium, that it will still be liable for transactional tax payments as any other medium would. But you've also touched on something which is interesting because the cash economy is quite interesting because you might say on one hand, people say, well, it's where criminal activities take place. But on the other hand, it also, particularly in America, it enables a lot of entrepreneurship. It's a lot of ways for people to spring up new businesses.
Right.
So, and that's through anonymous transactions. So there's an interesting security and privacy, but also entrepreneurial aspects around it, which I think are quite interesting. It's an inhibitor to have all your cash controlled by a central government, particularly because once you do that, the risk is that they introduce negative interest rates, and you can't combat that if all your money is controlled by banks governed by the central banking system.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess that's another thing that I wanted to bring up is that the whole privacy aspect of these digital currencies. We've seen in the past few years after the Snowden leaks this push against government surveillance in all forms. And digital currency is just another form of government surveillance, if not in a roundabout way. So do you think, we're already gravitating to it, but do you think that society will push to keep physical currencies as some kind of fallback, or
I think so.
Are we just destined to go down this digital route no matter what?
I think cash will still be there'll be a strong social attachment to cash. I think there's some interesting things in the digital currency space. For example, now we have a lot of fiat money that isn't necessarily connected to a physical good. And in the past, we had money that was connected to gold, the gold standard. One of the UK Mint is, I believe it's the Mint. I think of the right organisation.
I think we know what you mean. So.
yeah. Well, they're doing an experiment, a Bitcoin experiment. So they provide currency, but they're doing a Bitcoin experiment which connects a Bitcoin element or a Bitcoin value to a physical piece of gold. So it's almost using a 21st century mechanism and connecting it to a standard that we
like an old
moved
gold
away
standard
from in the past. Yeah. So that for me is an interesting mashup of technologies and even ideas of what currency and monetary value is.
Yeah, and I'm pretty much in sync with everything you said. I guess maybe we can talk about some of the other trends that you listed. You said there were another 2 or 3?
Yeah, well, there's other. I wanted to throw that one in. I mean, that like a cluster of things that happen that are turning together that create an interesting thing to track.
Mm-hmm.
And so the next one is I'm interested in automation. Everyone's looking at the decline of employment, the gig economy, ideas of having a basic income as opposed to living off state benefits, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The problem of education, where we may be educating young people for jobs that don't exist. And we've come from a place of, as an individual, we get satisfaction from making effort and being rewarded for that effort.
Right.
You work harder, or you demonstrate, you upskill yourself, and you work in smarter ways, and you get rewarded for that. We have a reinforcing loop that's satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
And as we move towards automation, there's less opportunity for people to get that reward loop if it's all based on money.
Mm-hmm.
So, if our meaning comes from increasing our finance. And as we move towards societal challenges in many affluent societies of an aging population, can we change the way that we get satisfaction from helping people,
Mm-hmm.
doing things of community value? So that's why I talk about the challenge of meaning, that we move from rich rewards to rich satisfaction from contributing to society and having that validated, not just physical sense, but also in our media and the way that we think about society generally.
It's very little known, but the charitable, the not-for-profit space is, I believe, the third largest employer of people worldwide. It's just in a collective sense, where it's not something that we think about because it's a lot of people, they don't work for charities or not-for-profits, full time. They might work piecemeal, like a few hours each week or each month, but collectively it aggregates up to a great deal of time, and that can be expanded out as automation grows. Do you think that the whole life after mass full employment, this kind of era that presumably will happen over the next 25, 30 years.
Yeah.
It's interesting because automation should be a good thing. This is what capitalism was designed to do. It's supposed to encourage capital owners to use their capital more efficiently. And purchasing robots, making your line more automated, bringing down labor costs, selling your products at cheaper and cheaper rates. That's what capitalism is all about.
Yeah.
But we're reaching this interesting tipping point in history where we can make everything for so cheap. But if robots are making everything, who is going to be able to afford to actually buy the things that the robots make?
Yeah.
So it's that kind of catch-22 that on this point where everything will become so abundant, but ironically, it will lead to economic collapse if there isn't some kind of quote-unquote socialist correction to this capitalist excess, if you will. So I think that's where a lot of this talk among governments and Silicon Valley of kind of instituting this universal basic income is coming from.
I'm not sure. I think it's a bit of a trap, though. If we say something isn't capitalism, then it's socialism, because that's almost going backwards. We've got this opportunity. If we've got abundance, if we can start working shorter weeks, how do we find that satisfying? I guess that's where I'm heading with my the meaning challenge.
And I guess to be fair, I mean, all governments, even in this capitalist age, are partially socialist in some way. The universal basic income is already being enjoyed by a segment of the population, senior citizens. After they retire, they get this stipend, which is basically the UBI. And likewise, when you're a child, you're getting a kind of parental UBI, where you're completely dependent on your parents for shelter, for food, for, income in terms of your like weekly allowance or what have you. So basically the first 15 to 20 years of your life, you're living with some form of UBI. And then the last sunset years of your life, you're living under a UBI. So over the next 20 years, we're just trying to figure out how we can afford to provide your traditionally working years, your adult years, with a UBI.
Your independence. It's when you step out and you become an independent, self-efficacy, the ability that you play a part in the world and it's meaningful for you and other people, and you have that feeling of independence. It's a life transition stage that we're used to, and if that gets disturbed, how do we adjust to that?
And I guess, I mean, the danger of depending solely on a UBI is that we're basically saying that after a certain point, the only use for individuals is to be a consumerist, to buy things or to buy experiences. And that's basically the limits of your value. So what are some of the ways that governments may try to help their populations find self-worth aside from just giving them a UBI? Would it be instituting some kind of like make work programs?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, and I think that's where America can be stronger, because it's more used to that independent thinking, and that goes right from the individual to local areas, neighborhoods, the state level, and then the national level. And people have got some responsibility for working together to achieve something in a granularity that countries which have perhaps had a stronger socialist attachment, such as the UK or other main Western European countries, that they're less used to. They look more to the center for how to act as opposed to being used to organizing themselves locally.
And the other thing that we're worried about on our end is that with the rise of automation, usually, automation is a very capital-intensive endeavor. Realistically, only the countries that can afford investments into heavy artificial intelligence and robotics will be able to afford this wave of automation, to be able to afford to become the leaders in this automation space. So there could be a threat where the developing world gets left even further behind because, countries like America, like Germany, Japan, China, Korea, these countries that already have this huge head start in robotics and manufacturing, that's only going to snowball. And in the future, these countries may become the factories of the world. And what will be left for, the developing nations to contribute to the global economy?
Okay, there was some interesting statistics earlier this week or last week from the States about the automation of electronic vehicles, artificial intelligent vehicles, and saying that that's more likely to happen in the trucking industry. I don't know if you saw this. And so if a population that relies on a particular trade for easing goods transport, but also providing an important employer, if that's removed, that might be harder to step back from than if you never had that infrastructure in place. You see what I mean?
Because I guess with the UBI, the amount of the UBI would be considerably less in developing countries, given their already lower standard of living and exchange rate and what have you. So potentially it could be more affordable for them than for countries like in the developing world.
I think that's an interesting thing in there where we need to look at those indicators of happiness and social cohesion, where we need to wrap those in as well. So, for example, in Scandinavia, they might have a very satisfying lifestyle, which they do, and their personal satisfaction, but they're not necessarily as wildly affluent as you might see displayed in the Middle East. So, finding satisfaction from explicit or overt wealth or a lifestyle is interesting, and I'm glad we've gone down this route, because it sort of steps onto my third trend. If you'd like to go there for a little bit, I'm glad we went there, because I'm interested in change in different countries. I look at pace effects, how things are happening in different countries. For example, another way of looking at it is it's the great experiments. What great experiments are taking place around the world? So Africa has been doing that, the well-known M-Pesa scheme, which is the payment scheme that runs through the mobile telephone network. For example, it famously allowed a telco to effectively act as a bank for the unbanked. It was a surprising emergent feature of mobile telecommunications. So something to learn from there that can be transplanted into the more affluent societies. Recently, there's been press about power supply outages in South Australia, in Australia. And why is that interesting? Because they've been very aggressive in moving towards renewable energy sources. So what we're seeing there is a great experiment. Is if you move towards renewables, how does that really? What are the challenges does that present to an affluent area that needs to manage its energy supply? And so they've found things that, yes, you can generate energy from the home, but it turns out our legacy grid can't actually take as much back into the grid if it's produced from excess in the home back into it. So there's really interesting things that are happening around the world, such as the aging population in Japan. They're way ahead of us in the proportion of aging population, and also in terms of available work to give satisfaction to their younger generations. What's happening there? How are they coping with it? So for me, it's those pace effects and how we can learn from these problems that people are ahead of us with, and also these advances that they're ahead of us with in any country.
Maybe let's take a few examples. So I visited Japan just last year. It was a great trip. And how would you say they're trying to adapt to a future that's, I think, only 10 to 20 years from now, a sizable percentage of their population will be senior citizens. So what strategies are they employing to adapt to this changing demographic? Is it new longevity type treatments that we're seeing in Silicon Valley being invested in? Is it investments into robotics? So, robotic caregivers? Is it make work programs for the young to take care of the elderly? How are you seeing Japan trying to adapt to this? Because after Japan, China is going to be right after them due to their one-child policy. Their demographics are aging rapidly. So that's going to be even more of a time bomb. And same with Europe after that.
Yeah, China is interesting because it's also got a highly dispersed. Their population is much more dispersed than Japan, which is all quite. Their population density is much higher, so there's quite different things there. But let's go back to Japan. Let's just pick one of those things that you talked about. And I think robotics is a really interesting one, because when the Japanese have looked at robots, they've certainly gone full on into how can robotics help us care for the elderly. How can they both act as assistants to move people around, but perhaps more interestingly is that problem of loneliness. As people get older, their family may be distant from them. They may lose their friends. So they're also looking at robotics and saying, well, how can we present them in a lifelike state, or either in a human form, or might even be in a pet, to give the emotional comfort as well. So I think the Japanese haven't just looked at the physical needs, but they're looking at the social and psychological needs, and that's really, that can be very rich. And there's an interesting thing about robots and Japan to contrast in the media, where in the West we tend to associate, in the past we've had this idea of associating robots with threats and evil and turning around and doing bad things, the Terminator, for example. So there's been a negative idea about them. Whereas the Japanese have always had a much more positive presentation of robots. So they're not as stigmatized in being presented to people.
And I think that's also part of the religion too, right? Because Shintoism, where even inanimate objects or animals or what have you, they can have souls or something of that nature. So I think that's one of the reasons why Japanese have such a higher degree of comfort with robots and artificial intelligence, because based on their culture, their background, they have an easier time thinking of artificial intelligence and robots as equal to themselves in terms of life forms.
Yeah. So that you touched on something, the idea that robotics is paired with artificial intelligence, because it's robotics. Robot is the manifestation of a physical independent thing, but then the development of artificial intelligence allows it to actually do things and react. So rather than just be a bunch of instructions being executed, artificial intelligence has the potential to add personality and to become blended to support to individuals. So there's interesting crossovers there.
So I guess let's walk away from Japan for a second, because just like we said, the demographic trends in Japan are pushing them to become leaders in robotics, and that could have a wide range of beneficial impacts on a range of industries throughout the world. And I think another example would be China, because due to their heavy industrialization over the past 20 years, they've suffered heavily in their environment. And it's something that their population is beginning to protest about almost daily now from official Chinese reports. And in deference to this popular discontent around the state of the environment with all the smog and air quality, China is now becoming a leader in renewable energy. Because of China's investments into solar, we can likely thank China for the amazing cost reductions in solar panels over the past 5 years, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. I mean, challenges can bring out the best in a society. They have a problem, and how do they deal with it? They don't deny it. They look for a solution to cope with it. And China's been through that that big industrialization phase, as you've said, and they've gone through making all the mistakes with pollution generation that a lot of other countries have been ahead before them, and they've looked at them and they've seen, okay, we need to cope with erosion, clean water problems. How do we solve that? And they can make faster decisions, and that's the idea of technology leapfrogging, where you have a nation that advances quickly. It can look for lessons that others have gone through and apply those lessons, and even get ahead, because they invest in what's the key intervention that we need to do that's going to help us the most.
So I guess bringing this home to the individual listener, let's touch on the subject of education, which you spoke about a little while earlier. Knowing that all these changes are coming for us, especially with automation and what have you, how should a young person view education? If they're trying to plan out their career over the next decade or two, is it worthwhile to specialize? Is it still worthwhile to even go to school? The investment into education is enormous these days, but alternatively, there is the concern that whatever you learn today might not even be around, 5 or 10 years' time. So it's this tricky predicament that a lot of young people are facing in this generation that might not have applied as much to generations in the past, just due to the fact that the pace of change today is so much faster than it's ever been.
Certainly. I've certainly heard stories of young people. One goes into education, incurs a lot of debt through achieving a tertiary education qualification, while another goes straight into a
trade,
an early into a trade apprenticeship, and moves through, and they have a much more secure and future ahead of them than the person who pops out of tertiary education with something that isn't necessarily applicable, because experience obviously is counts. There's that. I'm interested in this focus on STEM, the idea that, okay, well, if we get the basic, people have the core skills that they need to succeed, mathematics, technology, English, that will give them a lot of resilience and flexibility to go into things. Whereas flexibility and resilience may actually come from dealing with subjects which are less well defined, such as the arts, those have been stripped away, but in fact they may offer more resilience to people who are used to dealing with ambiguity. One of those things when you look forward ahead into the future, you're not just necessarily looking at one future. You might look at multiple futures, because there can be a divergence of possibilities out there. So being able to deal with ambiguity is a useful is a useful trade for people.
For sure. And I guess similar to your point, the past 10, 15 years, it was always thought that finance would be a safe career choice to get into. But nowadays we're seeing that AI hedge funds beginning to disrupt financial planners and investors in a substantial scale over the past 2 to 3 years, especially. We're seeing the same thing with accountants, where accounting software is basically killing the low end of accounting. And, as AI really makes headway into that field, potential AI accountants might supplant human accountants in, giant corporations, and even software engineering, which you would think is such a safe and profitable field to get into. Even software engineers are beginning to think that AI will be able to program its own software over the next, 15 years or so. So at that point, it's not so much how do you build this thing, but figuring out how to tell the software what to build, what questions to ask. Right?
That's exactly. That's where the creative premium that humans have over technologies which have some embedded thinking in them. So it's our creative ability to direct the tools of tomorrow to build the things that we need of tomorrow. Yeah. But not everyone's going to have that creative strength. So there might be very practical, physical things, fine, tasks that require fine skills that technology will take some time to develop. And that sort of takes me back to that meaning of that challenge, the challenge of meaning that we have, and how to respect people doing and respect yourself for doing a task. You're rewarded for your contribution to the community.
It's interesting. We're almost entering a new era where governments have traditionally needed to manage scarcity, where we're trying to protect our population by ensuring that everyone has enough just to get by. Whereas future governments will have to figure out how to manage abundance, where everyone will have more than enough to get by, but will they have enough to find meaning and happiness? And where today's governments are more concerned with providing for the basics, tomorrow's governments will have to figure out how to provide for the soul, for lack of a better term, right?
That happiness that we talked about, and that leads us back to state payment control. Controlling. How do we give people enough feeling of self-determination and self-efficacy that we retain the ability. The cash becomes a mechanism by which to do that. And I think on your website, there's another interesting aspect we haven't talked about, and that's what role does crime play in a future society which is challenged like this?
It's interesting because most of the common crimes that we have today will become obsolete tomorrow when it comes to petty theft in the age of the Internet of Things, where every individual object will have a sensor embedded into it and everything can be tracked. It'll become next to impossible to steal high-value goods because maybe future insurance companies, they'll specialize in insuring all your personal goods. So they'll have a sensor attached to every object you own. So your laptop, for example, they'll track its location everywhere. If it ever gets stolen, they'll be able to track it and get it back to you. Similarly with hacking and online theft, those kinds of crimes that are very difficult to address today. We're seeing programs with Microsoft's Watson supercomputer being trained to become a cyber warfare expert and cybercrime expert. And we could see in the future where AI make cybercrime next to impossible. So whether it's, physical crimes or online crimes, and we're even entering an age where there's so many cameras being installed all across our cities, where it's becoming more high risk for physical crimes to take in public. So, like I said, a lot of the traditional crimes that we're seeing today might not exist tomorrow, but
perhaps we want them. Perhaps we want them back.
Just make life a little bit exciting. But I'm sure there'll be future crimes that creative criminals can come up with at that future date. So maybe let's backtrack a little bit, where given what you do, what attracted you to the field of forecasting and futurism? Did you always work in this field?
No, I was originally in technology, and it was through my technology career that I became interested in the future. And really, my entry point was I was working in different countries around Asia, and I was fascinated how there were different cultures were adopting technology in different ways and at different rates. And there were different social structures there, political structures, and each one had its own economic problems, and it's also its religious base as well. And that fascinated me, that I wanted something that would tie all those together. And in my search for something that can do this, I found I was living in Melbourne in Australia at the time, and I found that it was one of the few, I think there's less than half a dozen places at the time, places in the world that taught foresight. It was a strategic foresight in a postgraduate level, a Master of Science, and so I did a master's in strategic foresight, and so that gave me the structure that sort of taught me about the field and the ways that you can think about the future in a productive way for others, or to help others bring them in, step into the future, because that's what you're doing. You're not sitting there isolated. It's about you helping others get the same benefits that you can see. And from there I then went into a corporate
and I guess
role.
How do corporations or governments make use of the forecasting services you offer?
Okay. Futures appears in strange places, but in unexpected places and different organizations. So in the corporate world, you might get them in futurists who work at the innovation level, where you bring your future thinking into innovation and product development, product prospection level. Or you might use them in the corporate strategy development. So if you think of corporate planning and corporate strategy, future thinking is really giving it's almost pre-strategy work of saying, how might the world flex and how might we do things within it? And so that then feeds back to your strategy. So those are a couple of places that it occurs. A futurist is also an interesting foil. They work with leaders in organizations, because often as an external futurist, you have a permission to think differently that the organization doesn't necessarily have. So you can say, really, your core product won't be needed in 10 years' time. What does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? Yeah. But and the interesting thing, or the interesting function that futures thinking plays in management teams, is to allow them to work together, because you take a team out 10 years into the future and everyone's on a ground they're not familiar with. So they start to learn to work together and also trial new possibilities out, and they can learn how to work on something else that occurs. They learn to be agile, the idea of being able to work with something new that happens. So if for example, you did a futures work on dealing with an aging population, for example, how would you cope with that? Say a government is dealing with that problem, and then in a couple of years' time there was an epidemic, for example, which gave a lot of large-scale healthcare problems to a high proportion of the population. Some of the learnings that you had from that exercise you did about the aging population can be applied in a different context, and also, rather than getting caught up in debates of the what and the how, the team can get on and do things together. So it's also acts as a way for teams can develop themselves. It's a tool in psychological preparation as well, because effectively, when you think about multiple futures, you're war gaming in a way with the possible future.
Interesting. And I guess maybe to bring this home again to the individual, how can learning about futurism or developing a better sense of how to think about the future, how can that help the individual better plan their lives?
I like the idea of signal and noise. Okay, you've got. I find that futurists can throw up a lot of ideas about the future, that can take energy away from doing something as
Right.
opposed to focus it. So I think first, futurists, just a bit of background, you and I understand that futurists are not focused on prediction. It's about possibility because we understand the future can flex in different ways. So for the individual, it allows you to say, not just plan on one future, to say the things could change, but not to get phased by that, not just look at one future, look at 2 or 3 possibilities and then be able to work out different strategies for them. Signal versus noise is really being more critical about what you're being told. And I think the big fuss around augmented reality and virtual reality is quite interesting here. If I use an example, we're seeing a lot of it around the consumer space. It's an extension of gaming, for example. And yet some of the best applications for this are potentially in the industrial world, for helping in healthcare and for helping in engineering projects. So it's not just accepting a trend, but thinking it through accepting one idea, but thinking it through in different contexts. So for an individual, it allows you to not your energy not to get too dispersed, but also to allow you to think of the implications of something in a different space.
I think that's a great point to end our discussion on.
Okay.
But before we wrap up, maybe you can share a little bit about what you're working on these days.
Public transport has been a big interest of mine, a big interest and client interest as well. So, and that's the transition. There's lots of change happening in public transport, and how does that transition affect us and affect our cities? That's one interest of mine. I've also been, I think I mentioned, I'm part of the Association of Professional Futurists, and I run a speaking program in London, or an event program in London, where I get futurists together to look at a problem, and futurists from different backgrounds as well get to work together because they appear in different industries.
Right.
So those are a couple of the activities that I'm working on right now.
Great. And where can people find you online, or how can they reach out to you?
They can just look me up on LinkedIn, Nick Price. If you do just search on Nick Price Futurist, or you can go to my website, which is ofthingsimmaterial.com.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, Nick, that was fun. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today.
David, thank you very much for the chance to talk to you.
The future of education, work in automation, long-term forecasting. What are your thoughts about the topics Nick and I covered? As always, send us your thoughts at feedback@quantumrun.com. We'll publish the most thoughtful feedback on our website. Again, I want to thank our guest Nick Price for joining us. You can find out more about him by searching for Nick Price Futurist in Google, or by going to his website, ofthingsimmaterial.com. And be sure to sign up for his regular newsletter, The Future View. Also, the podcast music you're listening to now was composed by Karl Gutowski. Finally, want to support the show? Then be sure to subscribe to it on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcasts. And while you're there, be sure to like, heart, share, review, and recommend this podcast to your friends. It really does help. That's it for now, but be sure to join us for another episode of Quantum Run-on-One.